A young woman set off for an art show in another city and vanished without a trace. When police got involved, they uncovered a few disturbing clues, but none of them brought them any closer to the truth. The case remained unsolved for nearly 50 years, until detectives finally uncovered an unexpected truth that shocked everyone. Mary Kathleen Schlais was born on November 11, 1949, in Champlin, Minnesota. She grew up in a large family, and from a young age, she had a real passion for art. Mary loved drawing, and by the time she reached high school, she already knew that art was what she wanted to dedicate her life to. She went on to study fine arts at the University of Minnesota, focusing on both painting and sculpture. Her teachers immediately recognized her talent. They saw something truly special in Mary and believed she had a bright future ahead of her. Mary even earned several scholarships and eventually graduated with honors. Her work was featured in a bunch of exhibitions, which was a pretty big deal for her back then. She also studied abroad for a while, picked up fluent German and Danish, and even started learning Japanese. After graduating, Mary kept chasing her passion and traveled whenever she could. Since painting didn't really bring in much money, she lived simply and tried to save where she could. She shared an apartment with a friend, and when she needed to get from one city to another, or even to a different state, she usually hitchhiked. Back then, hitchhiking was actually a pretty common way to get around. Public transportation wasn't all that reliable, and if you didn't own a car, getting to another city could be a real challenge. Buses were few and far between, especially in smaller towns. Plus, in the 70s, hitchhiking didn't carry the same dark reputation it does now. Stories about people going missing or getting attacked didn't spread as quickly as they do today, so most folks didn't think twice about it. On February 15, 1974, Mary was 25 years old and planning a trip to an art show in Chicago. The journey from Minneapolis was around 400 miles, so she wasn't planning to do it all in one go. Her idea was to hitchhike to a city called Madison in Wisconsin first, then make her way to Chicago from there. Around 10:30 that morning, she left home carrying a sign that said Madison and headed toward the highway. About 3 hours later, a man named Dennis was driving along a rural road in neighboring Wisconsin. At some point, he turned onto a long dead-end road and noticed a parked car with two people standing next to it, a man and a woman. As he drove past, it looked like they might have been arguing or even fighting, but Dennis wasn't totally sure what he was seeing. He kept driving, but the scene kept nagging at him. A few minutes later, he reached the end of the road, turned around, and headed back. But by the time he got there, the car was gone. Still, something in the snow caught his eye, and that's when he realized there was someone lying by the side of the road. Dennis didn't get out of his car. Instead, he rushed home and told his wife what he'd seen. Then, he asked his neighbor to go with him, and the two of them headed back to the spot together. When they arrived, it was clear that what Dennis saw really was a person. It was a young woman, and there was blood on her clothes. They immediately drove to the nearest house and called the police. When officers arrived at the scene, they confirmed that the young woman was already dead. She had multiple stab wounds, but something didn't add up. There wasn't much blood in the snow, which suggested she'd been killed somewhere else and left there afterward. Not far from the body, police found a man's hat, which they believed might have belonged to the killer. Crime scene techs also tried to make casts of some tire tracks nearby, but the snow made it impossible for the casting material to set properly. There were no other clues to go on, so the body was sent off to the medical examiner for further investigation. In the meantime, police spoke with the only witness they had, Dennis, hoping he could give them something to work with. Based on Dennis's statement, he'd seen a white, slim-built man, probably between 25 and 35 years old, about 5 feet 8 inches tall with light brown hair. As for the car, it was a small, gold-colored sedan, but Dennis didn't catch the model or license plate. Meanwhile, the medical examiner determined that the victim had been stabbed around 15 times and died from blood loss. There were also several defensive wounds on her arms, which showed she had tried to fight off her attacker. However, there were no signs of sexual assault, which ruled out the most obvious motive. As they continued working on the case, the coroner was finally able to identify the victim. It was Mary. After speaking with Mary's roommate, police learned she had been planning to attend an art show in another city. The roommate also mentioned that Mary had taken her purse with her, but it was nowhere to be found at the crime scene. Knowing that she left the house around 10:30 a.m. and that her body was discovered roughly 3 hours later, detectives were able to piece together a rough timeline. The drive from her home to where her body was found would have taken about an hour and a half, meaning it was very likely that the person who picked her up in Minneapolis was the one who killed her. Police put together a composite sketch of the suspect based on Dennis's description and shared it with the local newspapers, hoping someone might recognize him. A few tips did come in, but none of them brought investigators any closer to finding the killer. At the same time, detectives started to wonder if Dennis himself might have been involved, and they had a few reasons to think so. They knew for a fact that he was on a remote dead-end road, and no one else had seen the other man he described. Some parts of his story also didn't exactly add up. Dennis claimed he'd gone to the store that day, and on the way back, he decided to keep driving for a while. When asked why, his explanation was unusual. He said his dog was with him in the car, and he thought she wanted to go for a longer ride. The reason raised more than a few eyebrows, especially since Dennis had taken a turn onto a dead-end road that hardly anyone ever used. Another thing that raised suspicion was Dennis's behavior. When he found the body, he didn't get out of his car. Instead, he drove all the way home to bring his neighbor back with him. While he was home, he didn't even bother calling the police. That only happened after his neighbor saw the body for himself. To investigators, it looked like Dennis might have been trying to stage an alibi, or at least distance himself from the crime. But there were also a few things that pointed away from him being involved. For one, there were tire tracks on that road that didn't match his car. Still, detectives couldn't rule out the possibility that another vehicle had simply passed through before the murder. Police also couldn't find any evidence that Dennis had been in Minneapolis that morning, which meant he likely couldn't have picked Mary up in the first place. But even that wasn't a sure thing. It was still possible that Mary got a ride from someone else first and then ended up in Dennis's car later. Police kept pressing Dennis for answers, but he stuck to his story. At one point, they even brought in a hypnotist to try and unlock any buried memories or hidden details. He tried twice, but both times it didn't work. Interestingly, one of the tips police received was an anonymous letter urging them to take a closer look at Dennis as a potential suspect. However, the letter didn't include any new information or evidence, just a vague warning. With no progress being made on that front, investigators started looking for any other possible leads. That's when they stumbled across an unsolved case from 2 years earlier, and it immediately caught their attention. Back in 1972, a young woman named Jolly from Minneapolis decided to hitchhike home, and 15 hours later, her body was found near a river on the outskirts of the city. Detectives started looking into a possible connection between her case and Mary's, since there were some clear similarities. Jolly's friends had seen her getting into a gold-colored car driven by a young man, and just like with Mary, the medical examiner found no signs of sexual assault. But despite how similar the two cases seemed, the investigation into Jolly's murder hadn't led anywhere either. There were no solid leads and nothing to go on. Investigators tried to find any thread linking the two cases that might point them to the suspect, but every lead ended up going nowhere. Over the next few months, detectives looked into a number of potential suspects, but none of them could be linked to Mary's murder. They also found a few witnesses who claimed they'd seen a man matching the composite sketch, driving a gold-colored sedan, but once again, it didn't lead anywhere. Eventually, the case went cold. Investigators just couldn't find a single new lead to move things forward. In the years that followed, the case was reopened several times, but each time, it hit the same dead end. In the early 1980s, police came up with a theory that Mary's killer might have been a serial murderer named Randall Woodfield. He had confessed to killing 44 people and was serving a life sentence. Most of his victims were picked up while hitchhiking, which made him a logical suspect in Mary's case. But despite the similarities, detectives were never able to find any concrete link between him and the murder. In the following years, investigators followed up on hundreds of leads that took them across nearly every US state, and even into Canada. But still, they couldn't figure out who had killed Mary. Over time, Mary's murder became something of a local legend, especially in the county where her body was found. People started reporting strange sightings of a young woman walking along the roadside, trying to hitch a ride. But as soon as they looked away, she'd vanished without a trace. 2 fishermen claimed they saw a similar-looking woman near a lake. They said she was glowing with a soft white light and just stood there in silence, watching them from a distance. Later on, a local woman came forward saying that a murdered woman named Mary regularly visited her and spoke to her. Since the case was never solved, those paranormal stories eventually became far more well-known than the actual crime. Many people didn't even realize that behind the ghost stories was a very real tragedy. In the early 2000s, as DNA analysis became a standard tool in criminal investigations, detectives decided to take another shot at finding a genetic trace of Mary's killer. Back in '74, the medical examiners had found traces of blood and skin under Mary's fingernails, likely from the attacker. The evidence was still sitting in storage, but unfortunately, experts weren't able to extract a usable DNA profile from it. But there was still one more lead. Remember the hat found near the crime scene? It had been kept in evidence all these years, and inside were a few short strands of male hair. Forensic experts tested them and managed to pull a partial DNA profile. But once again, they hit a wall. There were no matches in the FBI's database. Still, it wasn't all for nothing. That DNA was enough to rule out several suspects, including the serial killer they'd once suspected, since his DNA had long been on file. The case remained cold for several more years, until late 2022, when detectives learned about a new DNA technique called genetic genealogy. Realizing this might be their last real chance to solve Mary's murder, they reached out to a college lab in New Jersey that specialized in this kind of research, and the lab agreed to help. The experts got to work using the partial DNA profile taken from the hair inside the hat. The fact that it wasn't a full profile made things much harder, but after a long process of combing through public genealogy databases and building out possible family trees, they eventually landed on a potential suspect, a man who matched all the necessary criteria. All that was left was to get a DNA sample from him. Detectives tracked him down and asked if he'd be willing to provide one, and he agreed. But to their surprise, the DNA didn't match. Then, the analyst suggested another possibility. Maybe the killer was his first cousin. Detectives followed that lead and collected a second DNA sample, but once again, no match. The whole situation was baffling. Both of those men were clearly close biological relatives of the killer. That much was certain. But there wasn't anyone else in their family who could possibly be the suspect. That's when experts suggested a new theory. What if the killer had been adopted? That would explain why he didn't show up anywhere in the known family tree. The team began digging through old records to investigate that possibility. And on November 4th, 2024, they finally found what they'd been looking for. Based on everything they uncovered, there was a strong chance that the biological relative they'd been searching for was an 84-year-old man named John Miller. Detectives started looking into Miller's background and discovered that he had a daughter. They reached out to her, and she agreed to provide a DNA sample. When the results came back, it was exactly what detectives had been hoping for. The hair found in the hat at the crime scene belonged to her father. And just like that, 50 years after Mary's murder, investigators finally uncovered the identity of her killer. As soon as the lab confirmed the DNA match, detectives went straight to his home. Almost immediately after they told him about the DNA evidence, John Miller calmly confessed. He said that on the day of the murder, he picked up Mary on the side of the road and promised to give her a ride to her destination. But once they got out of the city, he started pressuring her for sex. When she refused, Miller pulled out a knife and stabbed her multiple times. Then, he drove down that remote dead-end road, planning to bury her body in the snow. While he was dragging her out of the car, a man drove by. Panicked, he jumped back in his vehicle and sped off, leaving the body lying by the roadside. The next day, he saw a newspaper article about the murder and felt relieved. The witness, it turned out, had gotten the color of his car wrong. According to Miller, he was driving a light blue car at the time, not a gold one. In the end, he said he didn't feel much of anything about what he'd done and had barely thought about it since. Miller also told detectives that he had tossed the murder weapon into a swamp near his home, though he couldn't remember what he did with Mary's purse. When asked if he had killed anyone else, Miller said no. He claimed he didn't even really understand why he had killed Mary in the first place. After his confession, he was officially charged with murder and taken into custody to await trial. But Miller made it clear he had no intention of fighting the charges. He said he would plead guilty because he didn't want to go through a long court process. As far as he was concerned, he was ready to spend the rest of his life in prison. So, in the end, detectives were finally able to solve this complicated case, even if it took 5 decades to get there. Despite the fact that Miller is now nearly 85 years old and unlikely to spend many more years behind bars, the case of Mary Schlais has finally been closed. As for Jolly's murder, Miller's involvement now seems unlikely. Given that he was driving a completely different colored car back then, it's very possible he had nothing to do with that crime. Still, investigators are looking into whether he might be connected to any other unsolved cases. But so far, they haven't found anything to tie him to any additional murders. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.